seats, and you have to listen to a small commercial, and then we go. The Friends of the Mamaroneck Library welcome you all. I can't see anybody because of the strong lights.
You can't see if they have guns.
And, or vegetables. We're happy to have you here, and we're happy to present these writers, sports writing then and now. They tell a story of a Hollywood funeral some years back when the most hated man in that community died, and there was an overflowing attendance at the service. And later they were talking about it, and one man said, well, if you give the people what they want, they'll turn out. So
Thanks a lot, Fred.
you've turned out, and this is a happy occasion.
Which one of us has to die?
I'm Fred Rosenberg of the Friends. We want to thank the Emlyn and the director, Mr. David Watson, for allowing us to use the theater. I do want to stress that it's the library that is putting this on. The Friends of the Library is an organization that subsists on the contributions from the Friends, and I'll tell you what we do with what we get. We know how vital libraries are. The New York Times had a fine article back in November writing about the Carnegies. There's a quote from Mr. Carnegie, the original gentleman, Andrew. One thing I have always had in mind in building libraries was that there might be in every town an open door through which the bright and ambitious boy, there were no girls in those days, could find his way out into the world. I think I'm doing a whole lot for the morality of the country through my libraries. So we feel that way. Every community has a library. We have a nice one. And that's the importance of an event like this, where people are interested in what the library is doing and will come out. We're a volunteer group, the Friends. As I say, the funds come solely from contributions. I put some envelopes, not too discreetly, out in the lobby. If you care to join, that would be very nice. You get on the mailing list. What we do with the dollars goes directly to programs that we have, children's programs. We're especially pleased with that. Certain equipment in the library, computers in particular that bring in information for people, refurbish areas that are used and that need some repair, this kind of thing. Our panel tonight has put a lot of ink on a lot of paper. 4 careers with untold numbers of articles, many, many books. We actually had hoped for a 5th panelist. As you know, Russia invented baseball, and I got in touch with Moscow, but there was nobody there that they could release, so that it's an all-American affair this evening. They can discuss whatever the Russian claim is if they want to. In terms of our subject, which is sports writing then and now, made me think of a friend who grew up in a small Kansas town. And he said, yeah, we had a newspaper, and everybody read it. He said, but they didn't read it to see what happened. Everybody knew what happened. They read it to see who got caught. Maybe that bears a little on the subject and on where we are now in sports writing. From your left, Maury Allen is a columnist for the Suburban Gannett papers, has written many books. He's a former chairman of the New York chapter of the Baseball Writers Association of America. What I would like to do is introduce the men, come across the table, and after I say a few words, just to give a little background, have each person say a few things. Your work, if you wish, your current outlook, just to put in perspective what you may say later, and we'll go from there. So, Maury?
It's a pleasure to be here, of course. Anytime you come to a room filled with people who are actually willing to listen to writers. It's very exciting. And I'll just say a little bit about my career, which began professionally in a town in Seymour, Indiana, southern Indiana. I made $28 a week, and I was a sports editor of the first newspaper that I ever worked on, so I knew that there was no place to go but down when you start at the top. But the best thing about making $28 a week on a little paper in Seymour, Indiana in 1955, right after getting out of the Army, is I could send $4 home to my parents in Brooklyn, so that was pretty exciting. And it always was a wonderful career and is a wonderful career because it beats working, and that's why I've always enjoyed it.
Thank you. Marty Appel. He again is the author of many books, among them an encyclopedia on the Hall of Fame, which he may want to say something about. That would be up to him. And the current book that is out over his name is a Slide Kelly Slide, which has been nominated as one of the best books of last year, 1996. Marty?
Thank you. It's a treat for me to be here. This is really home base for me. I live in Larchmont, and to be in the company of my good friends, Maury and Bob and Roger. When Maury talks about how much work goes into this profession, I consider myself one lucky guy because, for some of you who might know me, when I was in college in the 60s, I wrote a letter to Bob Fischel, the legendary public relations director of the Yankees, and I asked if I could have a summer job, thinking I'll never even get a response. It's the Yankees. And I did get a response, and I was fortunate enough to be hired to answer Mickey Mantle's fan mail in the summer of 1968. And that led to full-time employment at the Yankees. And I served them ultimately as Bob's successor, as PR director, and later as television producer while working at WPIX. So in a sense, I went from college right into this dream profession, had the opportunity to meet writers who even went back to the 20s and 30s who were still on the scene in the 60s. And to me, they were as celebrated as the ball players were. In fact, not that he goes back that far, but the very first day I worked at Yankee Stadium, I met Maury Allen. And when I got home that evening and everybody wanted to know, tell us about your first day, it was, I met Maury Allen. So, they were my heroes because I read them. I read the World Telegram and I read the Journal American, and I absorbed so much. And working for the Yankees gave me the opportunity to absorb a great deal of baseball lore and history, listening to the older writers, and ultimately the opportunity to write some books myself. I work for Topps now, the trading card manufacturer, so we're in all sports, but you could also say I've never worked a day in my life. I've enjoyed every day going to work.
Robert W. Creamer. He's a longtime writer for Sports Illustrated and author of some definitive biographies, one on Stengel, one on Babe Ruth, called Babe. Ruth is supposed to have said that writers should write two biographies of him, one for the kids and one for the grown-ups. And Bob wrote the one for the grown-ups. Say a few words for us.
I just think one of the nicest things about being in sports is that it's a very small circle. And you sit here, there's Maury, I work with at Sports Illustrated, and Marty, I have lunch with every month, and Roger, who took me to Ebbets Field the first time I was there. It just seems to me you keep bumping into people and seeing them again, and most of the time sports writers don't spend as much time writing as they do talking, just telling stories back and forth. It's a lot of fun. I got into this Dodge by accident, really. I came out of the Army in 1945, 46, or it was, and went to work for an ad agency. I worked for ad agencies for 3 or 4 years, kept getting fired because I was the worst copywriter who ever lived. I was terrible. A very nice man named Bill Bernbach, who later formed the agency called Doyle Dane Bernbach, fired me once, and he said, take your time. He said, you're in the wrong business. He said, you're a good writer, but you're doing the wrong thing. And so I eventually got out of it, and I went to work for an encyclopedia. Shows you how close to sports I was. And by default, I became the de facto sports editor of the encyclopedia. And after I was there 4 years, someone put a clipping on my desk saying, you ought to look into this. And there was a little clipping saying that Time Incorporated was starting a new sports magazine. So I began to write letters and talk to people, and a few months later, to my great delight and satisfaction, I was hired, and I've lived happily ever since. It was, working at Sports Illustrated was a tremendous experience. I worked there the rest of my working career till I retired some years ago. And the summer of '54, that's the year the magazine began, I had lunch one day with one of our editors, whose name I'm just not going to mention, and he introduced me to a fellow named Roger Kahn, who he was trying to hire for Sports Illustrated and succeeded in hiring. And I had known Roger Kahn's name for about 4 years, because he, I think roughly 4 years, he'd started to appear in the sports pages of the Herald Tribune, which was a marvelous sports section. And I remember the feeling of delight when I first saw Roger's byline, because it was just this refreshing, intelligent copy. I shouldn't say this, we were sitting here. It's all right?
If I wink stuff.
Okay. But it was a true pleasure to meet him. And he, of course, had been covering baseball, covering the Dodgers for several years. And he was going out to Ebbets Field. I had never been out to Ebbets Field. I'd been to the Polo Grounds in Yankee Stadium all my life as a sports fan, coming down from Westchester. But he took me out to Ebbets Field into that little tiny press box. It was about this big. And really introduced me to people. I met Dave Anderson that day. I met a lot of people, and it just really started my tremendous enjoyment of baseball and baseball coverage and sports writing. So I want to thank you, Roger. It's very good. Roger also, when I wrote my book on Babe Ruth, he gave it the definitive adjective and a piece he did on it. He said, Robert Creamer in his forthcoming book. So all my books are called forthcoming. Anyway,
Some say I'm a better critic than a writer.
so anyway, it's been a very nice life. I got lucky, wrote a few books, and still have all these great friends. It's been a pleasure.
So you figured out who this gentleman is, Roger Kahn. Probably best known for the classic Boys of Summer. He is still friendly with a number of the men who are on that team who are around, although now he's embroiled in writing about the Dodgers coming back to Brooklyn, and he can discuss
We're going to use Bob Creamer's credit card to bring that to pass.
he can discuss that. But as I'm sure all these men are, Roger has a broad scope which goes beyond baseball and beyond sports. This is a plain stage, but Roger, is going to provide really a three-dimensional setting for our discussion. When and how did then become now? Now, we want the audience to to take part at appropriate times in an appropriate way in this program. So, as well as we can see out there,
Yes.
if you raise your hands when it makes sense to ask a question, and we'll be going back and forth here too. Just comments, questions, no speeches. Mr. Kahn.
Thank you. Al Campanis taught us all you'd better be prepared. So I'm going to ad lib, but I was sort of moved by Bob's remarks. I think he is as good a critic as I think. He's written about my books, I've written about his, and there'll be fisticuffs later. But one thing I remember, so I had a very moving period with a ball player we both know, W. Howard Mays. And he began to tell me, and I was working, but he began to tell me about the catch. And it was just like poetry, listening to Willie say how he had to get the ball back to the infield. And I listened, spellbound, privileged to be there. This was only about 4 months ago. And I said, I remember where I was when you made the catch. I was standing with Bob Creamer between third base and left field in the Polo Grounds. And Willie said, well, as soon as the ball left the bat, I knew I would catch it. I said, Bob and I didn't know that. He said, that don't matter, I knew I did. That's a truism from Atherton, California. Just a few years ago, the Walt Disney Company, which owns just about everything on earth, decided to buy me. As it happened, my life was going so happily, I wasn't then for sale. But like every other freelance author in America, if the proper terms could be arranged, I was available for lease. And the deal was done. Disney, through its publishing arm, Hyperion Press, asked if I would consider this topic what America used to love about baseball. Since this project would keep me close to an interest, baseball, and to a great passion, the written word I signed on with the giant mouse who works out of Anaheim. Quickly, I mean, we have a somewhat Tel Aviv panel. I want to get a little bit of an ethnic mix here. Quickly, I was reminded of Yeats's words from his great poem, Among School Children, William Butler Yeats. How can I tell the dancer from the dance? How can I tell the dancer from the dance? As you review this rich story, you soon become aware that the game, baseball, and the people who played it, and just as surely those who have written about it, are part of a quite magical tableau. Babe Ruth, Bob's Guy, and Jackie Robinson surely, but also Haywood Broun and Ring Lardner, Mantle and Mays indeed, but also Red Smith, Stanley Woodward, Bernard Malamud, and Henry Luce. If not all of those names are familiar. I hope they will be by the end of the evening. Well, Maury was out in the fields of Indiana. I actually joined the Herald Tribune, a writer's paper, in 1948. My first assignment, speaking about money, was a walking race from City Hall to Coney Island. I got $5 and a few readers. I wrote Little Big League Ball in '51, emerged as a full-blown baseball writer the following year. And in 1954, I was invited to a strange tango. Didn't work for me. Write baseball for this new magazine, Sports Illustrated. It was there that I met a sandy-haired kid, open-mouthed to be near big league clubhouses. A giant fan. And despite both of those things, a fellow with a hell of a lot of talent. The Sandy here is history, but he's sitting next to me now, Bob Creamer. Sandy. I signed on as sports editor of Newsweek in 1956. It was there I brought Dick Schaap into sports writing. With his 1960s, a great editor, Otto Friedrich, asked me to become editor-at-large for the Saturday Evening Post, the best magazine I ever worked for, and I branched out beyond sport. That's relevant in a few unusual ways. For example, I used to think that a one-sided doubleheader was pretty dull. I know now that one is not. Dull is hearing Barry Goldwater make the same speech 4 times in 12 hours. My first 2 serious books had nothing to do with sports. The Passion of People was to look at Jewish life in America, anti-Semitism, and other issues. The Battle for Morningside Heights, I'd say, with naked self-promotion, was called by Senator Eugene McCarthy the most important book written on the issue of student unrest. When the Saturday Evening Post died in 1969, I began to write The Boys of Summer. After I finished 3 years later, I had $380 in the bank. I had 3 children, 1 alimony, a lovely wife, as Bob will remark, and $380 in the bank. Saturday night, I threw a grand party. Zero Mostel came and Jackie Robinson. And after we paid Zabor's on Monday morning, the bank balance was $80. Then the telephone rang. The book of the month had taken The Boys of Summer as a main selection, and shortly would be sending over $150,000 and change. I think that offers you some sense of the reality of an author's life.
Not mine.
Not mine.
But he also never had $80 in the bank. Solvent pro tem in 1983, I bought the Utica Blue Sox of the New York Penn League, and my team won the pennant, and the book I wrote, Good Enough to Dream, won the Casey Award for which Marty Appel's fine work about Slide Kelly. Slide has been nominated. I just wanted to ask you to lower your expectations, because at the victory banquet, the main dish was a ballpark hot dog. It ain't a Nobel Prize. I wrote Joe and Marilyn. God knows what people think of that. And what went on, what didn't go on between the two of them. And next, Pete Rose's people and a huge publisher asked me to set down Rose's life and times. Before that was done, he had been booted out of baseball and on his way to jail. It was not an easy time, but uniquely, I had seen the defense that Rose's lawyers planned to mount against organized baseball, and this perilous venture also gave me a view of how the modern media operates, which was in many ways quite chilling. The next thing I did was The Era, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and finished 8th, and then Disney came courting. Lines I found in my research is from the author Donald Honig, whom we all know and admire, would, I hope, set a keynote for the evening. I'm now going to quote Mr. Honig. As the 20th century began, America had run out of heroes. Earlier generations admired adventurers, Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, and men of action, Wild Bill Hickok, Buffalo Bill Cody. With the frontier gone, the country turned to baseball and new heroes, Mathewson, Cobb, and Walter Johnson and Babe Ruth. They were not from the unpathed wilderness, but they were playing America's own game on the bright green grass of home.
Marty, you,
I was going to say, that was excellent, but Al Campanis is still more memorable.
It's a shame you weren't PR director of the Dodgers, because you, not I, would have said to Peter O'Malley, Mr. Wimp, baseball is a high-risk business. Son of a gun inherits $300 million and he's whining. Oh, God, I have to get rid of this. You would have said, and he would not listen to me about this, that Al Campanis going on Koppel is not Al Campanis going on Virginia Graham. The story that Marty is prompting me to say in it, and if Bob knows it, it was 87. It was the 40th anniversary of the debut of Jackie Robinson in Brooklyn. And so there was a decision in baseball that there would be some memorializing of this great man. Paint 42 on every second base. They should only have been as nice to him when he was alive. And Koppel got involved in this through Uberoff, and they were going to do wasn't Jack a great man? I don't want to be, crudely, but Jack hired me to be his ghost for a little black sports magazine, and Jack and I closed it in 4 months. But we did some work together. We were good friends. Not as close as Howard Cosell, but Howard Cosell was close to everybody. We were good friends. I loved him, and I mourn for Jack. So, what could I say? And sat one day in that place in Connecticut, and I said, "Did you ever get asked to manage?" And he said, "Vancouver." And I don't know, it must have been the Pacific Coast League or something, I'm not sure. Yeah. And I said, "So what happened?" He said, "Oh, I'd be interested." And I said, "And?" And he was blind then, and he said, "They never called back." So now, I said, when Koppel's people call in the afternoon, the show is spontaneous, but not entirely spontaneous. You get asked what you might want to talk about. They said, "What would you like us to ask you?" And I said, "Why don't you ask me what Robinson would feel about blacks in baseball today?" Opening day, 87, and I got asked the question, and I said he wouldn't like it that much. I stammered a little bit. He said, "No black managers." Koppel's very polite. He said, and I'm in a studio in New York with a plug in my ear, and Campanis, sent by the Dodgers, is at opening day in Houston. And I don't, I'm not close to what's going on with him, and I see him on a monitor, and he says, Koppel said, "Mr. Kahn's statement to other no black managers, if it is true, to what you attribute it?" Campanis says, "Blacks lack the necessities to manage." It's a defining moment because, first of all, he says all blacks are dumb. And as he's saying that, he misuses the simple English word, necessities. Koppel was shocked. So was you. So was I. So we'll go to a commercial. Came back, gave it to him again. "You didn't really mean that." "Yes, I do." He said, "Yeah, they can't manage for the same reason they can't swim. They lack buoyancy." a couple said, how about lacking access to pools? And this goes on for a while, and it got worse and worse. And I just couldn't, stand this anymore. I said, I get it, that they have intelligence enough to work in the fields, the cotton fields, the ball fields, yes. But can they manage? Do they have that intelligence? Oh, no. The Dodgers issued a statement that they had a black scout. That's how liberal they were. They had 38 white scouts. They fired Campanis. And then the upshot of this was that I got cut off Peter O'Malley's Christmas list. I got a card from the publicity people, and I wanted to go to Peter, and I loved and hated Walter O'Malley, loved more than hated, and we didn't agree a hell of a lot. And he'd say, oh, I'm surprised the Froebel boy, a school I'd gone to, would write something as negative and terrible as that. And I said, well, that's what I wrote, and they said, all right, now what are we going to do positive this time? Always there was a confrontation, hard looks, and we were men together. And I went to see Peter, and I was going to say, Peter, I grew up with this team, I love this team the way Bob loves the Giants, and I want to help you so you don't do this again. And it's an obscenity that Jackie Robinson's team would have this. He refused to see me. He sent Fred Clare, his clerk, who was his general manager, and he said, Roger, what we thought you should have said was, Al, it's me, you don't mean that. You really don't mean that, do you, Al? It's me. And that's perhaps the disaster. It indicates the limits of Peter O'Malley as an owner, and I think somehow that feeds into the reason he wants to get rid of the Dodgers, and Maury knows this.
Well, I think there's another point here which I think has to be presented, and that is Campanis had been a very close friend of Jackie Robinson when Jackie Robinson broke in Montreal in 1946. He had been a player, he had helped him, he had soothed the way, and I think that's where his true feelings certainly were about Jackie Robinson. Now, we're talking about 1987 when they're talking about general managers, not managers. There were several managers by that time.
No, there was no manager.
There were several managers by 1987.
Frank Robinson was not managing.
Well, there had been several managers.
There was, what I said was, to get it right, I said, there is not now a field manager in the major leagues.
Okay, but I think what Campanis was saying, and I think he was cruelly attacked, because he represented a general thinking among executives in baseball. Unfortunately, he was the one that said it in a public place, and we only have to look a month or so ago at a company here in Westchester, at Texaco, to see what people are saying. So to have a kind of morality expected out of baseball executives that is not any different, I think, than executives in all walks of life is kind of expecting more than really exists. And I think we have to live in a realistic world. There's a lot of work to be done in that area, but the work that baseball and sports generally has done, and I think you would agree to this, Roger, in my mind, Jackie Robinson is one of the most significant figures in American history. Not in baseball, not in sports, but in American history. There will always be a Campanis saying what he said. There will always be people in Texaco saying what they said. But the overall contribution of American sports to true democracy with a small d in this country, I think is rather significant and rather to be admired. And the bottom line is, if you can do it as Willie Mays or Jackie or any of the players could do it, that's what the measure of people tends to be.
I've always thought...
How is the sports writer handling this? Go on.
Yeah, one thing I always thought, just, I guess we got on Jackie Robinson, this is the 50th anniversary of his debut. Baseball certainly gets no great credit for having been segregated for as long as it was, but it really deserves the credit it gets and then some for predating in American history by 7 years integration of schools. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, Jackie Robinson, 1947. So I don't think you throw a parade for baseball for saying, aren't we great, we finally integrated, but give baseball credit for being ahead of the curve on that at least.
How is the sports writer handling what's going on?
I think one of the most significant things about the way sports writers are handling it is that when you go to a press box today, you see an incredibly integrated press box, male and female, black and white, and I think that's the most significant aspect of what's happened in sports writing. They come from their own perspective, their own point of view. I was not a sports writer in 1947, but from what I read, and when I wrote a book on Jackie Robinson, I read a lot of the material. Most of the sports writers in 1947 were very much against Jackie Robinson making it in the big leagues. Either he couldn't play, they said, or it wasn't the right time, or the commissioner or baseball owners were very unhappy about it. So you have to measure Jackie Robinson in light of what was going on in America in 1947. And you can't compare 1947, I think, in that area to 1987 when it was Jackie's 40th, as Roger explained, or 1997 in the 50s. We live in a different America today. When Jackie Robinson came to Brooklyn, and I read Roger's stories and Bob's stories about those days when I was a kid in Brooklyn, people in Brooklyn didn't know, and I'm talking about my own teenage friends, didn't know there weren't blacks in baseball. Nobody talked about it. Nobody recognized it. Once in a while, I would go to a place in Brooklyn where a semi-pro team called the Bay Parkways played, and they would play against a black team. And you'd go on Sunday when you had nothing to do, when the Dodgers were on the road, and you'd watch the Bay Parkways play against the black Yankees or something like that. But the awareness of blacks not being in baseball was not something that most teenagers in New York had until the day Jackie Robinson showed up, until people wrote about it.
When you think about it, today's rosters, I'm not sure this is accurate, so I'm really just guessing, but I think today's Major League rosters are probably about 40% black. Would you say that's probably close to right?
Say 33 to 40.
33 to 40%, which means if this had been done right all along and baseball had been integrated, an awful lot of players on rosters from 1900 to 1947 were minor league ball players that were otherwise occupying spots on the rosters.
I knew early that there were no blacks in baseball because there was a big radio show, Sam Bolter. And if you listen to WHN, you heard him. But I'd like to hear Bob on this, because Bob did not come out of a Brooklyn background. Bob came out of a Giant background. And he was working in the cellar of an encyclopedia when all this was happening. And Bob.
I was thinking of two or three things, maybe they're irrelevant. One was that if the world had listened to Irving Rudd and me back in 1956, Jackie would have been a manager in 57, because Irving and I were going to buy the New York Giants and make Jackie the manager. Unfortunately, Irving didn't have as much money as I did. We had $27.50, so we didn't go very far with that. The other thing I was thinking of, you're talking about literature and baseball. Back in the mid-40s, I was reading Langston Hughes, who was a marvelous writer as well as a marvelous poet. He had a great character whose name was Jesse Semple. His friends called him Just Simple. And Just Simple was always going to cut on out over to Ebbets to see Jackie. And that was a great line, and that was that sort of lift that Jackie Robinson gave to a tremendous number of people, both black and white in those days. The only thing is that it was a tremendous time in 47 when Jackie came in. I can remember myself as a kid working for one of those ad agencies that kept firing me. In 1946, there was a great friend of mine named Joe Sacco, who was, I'm not sure he was a communist, but Joe was a real rabid kind of rabble-rouser in a very quiet, gentlemanly way. And he wanted people to go over to Brooklyn and just picket Ebbets Field until they brought Jackie up. And in 47, Joe was not a baseball fan either. This is just a cause. In 47, he kept saying that we've got to picket to make Ricky bring him up. And I remember as a baseball fan thinking, Robinson was on the Montreal roster, I think, until just the day before the season began in 47. But I think anybody who was a baseball fan knew that he was going to come up. There wasn't any doubt that he'd be up before the beginning of the
Well,
season.
Enos Slaughter didn't know that.
Well, Enos wasn't as bright as
But you kind of knew it the way you knew Tiger Woods was going to turn pro.
Yeah, they couldn't keep him down anymore. We had a tremendous year in '46 with Montreal. But the other point that made me think of all this was that '47 was a great time, '46 and '47, when Jackie broke in and started breaking things up, and then breaking the barriers down. And that same year, '47, Larry Doby came into the American League, and a year later, Satchel Paige was up, and there. Henry Thompson and Willard Brown played for the Giants briefly, went down and came back up again. No, I'm sorry, they played for the St. Louis Browns. St. Louis Browns, and Henry came back up with the Giants a couple years later. But 40 years later, 50 years later, you still have the Texaco attitude. You still have this kind of barrier that's there. Yeah. It's easy to look back at the way things were when I was a kid and think of the tremendous progress that African Americans have made. But I suppose you're an African American and you say, yeah? Yeah.
I think there's a wonderful illustration just a couple of days ago. I happen to be a World War II fan. I read a lot of the books and so forth. And an African American got the Congressional Medal of Honor the other day, 50 years later. So when I read it, my first reaction was, where was the Jackie Robinson of African American soldiers in 1947 to say, hey, we served, we deserve this, we want it, we were going to, fight for it.
Well, they were, Maury, with being court-martialed for not wanting to sit in the back of the bus as Jackie was.
Let me ask this now, because you made a point earlier, Bob, not necessarily this evening, but in our discussions. Sports writing, it's the writer who has to interpret, help interpret. Sports writing, sports reporting. Well, are they two different spheres?
Well, sure. I mean, there are reporters. Well, today's example, Peter Gammons of the Boston Globe is one of the great baseball reporters. I don't think Peter is a very graceful writer, but he's a tremendous font of information. When the Herald Tribune was flourishing, the Herald Tribune had a racing writer named Joe Palmer who wrote about horse racing. And I think 90% of his readers didn't care at all about horse racing, except the Derby and things like that. But Palmer wrote so beautifully and so gracefully and so charmingly that you read him all the time. So there you have sports writing as a writer. Sometimes we have too great an opinion of ourselves. We aren't that good as reporters. I mean, I don't want to keep telling you how great Roger is, but Roger is a tremendous reporter, also a very fine writer. He can go into things with his own, maybe, I wouldn't say prejudice mind, but where you might have a prejudiced opinion, but if he sees something that does not fit his prejudices, he doesn't go with his prejudices, he goes with the facts. In that book, The Boys of Summer, I'm trying to make a point here, not praising Roger. In The Boys of Summer, which is a terrific book, not just a terrific sports book, it's really one of the best books written in this country in the last 30 years. It's a tremendous picture of American life. This is a sports writer talking to baseball players, the old Dodgers, going back to see them. His chapters on Carl Furillo and on George Shuba are absolute masterpieces of what it was like to be a professional ball player and now be retired and be doing something else. Shuba talking about what his life was like. He said something in Roger's book that made me think of Satchel Paige. And again, the mindset of black athletes, people say, oh, they're naturals. Satchel Paige is just a natural. I mean, he could throw a ball at 90 miles an hour and hit a cigarette pack 9 times out of 10. And I've heard a marvelous interview with him once, where they asked Satchel Paige about his control. And lucky was he had this great control as well as the fastball. And Paige said, well, it's such a thing as I didn't have control when I was first pitching. But it's such a thing that when you practice something, you come to get good at it. And so Paige, the great natural, was a product of hard work. When Roger did his book, he was talking to George Shuba at his home out in Ohio, I think it was. And Shuba was a pinch hitter. They called him Shotgun Shuba, and he spent most of his time pinch hitting and hitting these beautiful flat line drives. Marvelous hitter to watch. And Roger said, this is why he's a good reporter, because he tells on himself. Roger said, yeah, but you are a natural hitter. And Shuba said, I'm probably misquoting, but Shuba said, oh, not you, too. And he took Roger down the cellar of his house, and he reached up, and he took from the rafter a baseball tied with a string, and he hung it down. And he said, every night, all through every winter, I came down here with a bat, and I swung, 40, 50, 60, 70 times at that thing. 70 times a night, all through the winter. This is the natural ball player. Hard work, hard work. And you can have all the stuff you want about athletes and the lazy bums they are and the drunks they are and the fights they get in, but boy, they work. That's why I get mad at people denigrating college basketball players, the majority of whom tend to be black, and that these guys get into college and they don't study and they don't learn anything, but boy, they do study. But they're studying basketball, they're studying moves, they're studying work. This is where their future is. Most of them don't make it, but that's where it is. But reporters, we don't always do that. We don't always find these things out. Again, Con did. Con made the point of finding out why an athlete is good, why they do things. Too many reporters sit back and just take the handouts. One of my objections to sports writing today is that you read the same story in 4 different papers and the same quotes are there. They're packaged quotes. They either come down from the publicity department or the guys all do the same tape recorder and take the same thing. There is not an interpretation of what they say. There isn't as much finding out and understanding. This is reporting and it's also stock writing. You have to look at something. I'll go back to something else. I'm jumping around too much and shoot me down in a second. Going back again 50, 60 years. In 1948, I think it was May 48, Israel was declared a republic. Now it's a country. And instantly the war started with the neighboring Arab countries all around there. And that war lasted about 6 or 7 months before they went into continual truce. There was a man who wrote for the Herald Tribune named Homer Bigart. I don't know how many people remember him, if anybody does, but Roger certainly would. I never met him, didn't know him at all. I understand he had a bad stammer.
Yes, he did. He
Terrible
was also a
stammer.
copy boy for 7 years before they
Before they gave him a
promoted
chance.
Yes.
This man had the handicap of not being able to talk easily. He worked hard, but he went to Israel and wrote about this thing. And he was the best war correspondent you could possibly ever read, because he listened to what the generals said and what the colonels said, and he'd go out and look and see what the privates were saying. And he wrote an intelligent, perceptive, interpretive report of what was going on, and you understood things more than you would in just reading the patent. Well, too much of our sports writing, back then, I'm not just saying this is today's sports writing, back in our day, there's a lot of pap written. This is one of the things about sports writing then and now. The tendency for us is to say, it was great back then and it stinks now. And it's not true. It stunk back then and it stinks now, and it's great back then and it's great now.
We were worse. Let me just, if I could.
I want to give you a chance to rebut any of the nice things that Bob said.
If I'm going to keep on talking, I'll say one other thing. Roger, one other thing. One of the troubles with sports writers is that we're myth makers. We make myths. We write about guys and we build them up, and maybe that's good, maybe it's bad, but they're myths. Now, Roger, in writing The Boys of Summer, did not create a myth and did not set out to create a myth. He wrote honest stuff, but it's been interpreted as a myth. And the myth is the beautiful borough of Brooklyn and the lovely relationship of the Brooklyn people to the Dodgers and that rotten Walter O'Malley stealing this club away from them. The point is that Brooklyn really abandoned the Dodgers before O'Malley did. Their great years were 46, 47, 48, 49, when the attendance went way up and they were leading the major leagues in attendance, except for Cleveland, I guess. And in 1950, 51, all of a sudden it just started going down. And the last 5 years, Nevitt's Field, they grew about 1 million.
That's right, but they also gave this to television and more people got boxes.
Yeah, but they
So you had a different situation. You had, Milton Berle is on and it's cloudy and might rain.
Yeah, that's too easy.
But you also
Everybody
had-
in Brooklyn moved to Long Island.
You had Levittown.
Well, that's true.
That's right, that's a big...
Let me go a little bit more.
Hey, I got one more thing I have to say, then I'll shut up. The other thing is,
I was saying to Fred, give it to Bob.
the glorious, lovely Ebbets Field, that charming place. Ebbets Field was a wretched ballpark.
That means he couldn't get
Only
the
a
washing
giant
between
fan
it.
could say that.
It was too small. It was so small. The outfielders played
That's
with their
called
backs.
intimate, Bob.
Intimate. They had their backs against the fence. The dugouts weren't much. The locker rooms were atrocious. The visiting clubs, it was a terrible ball.
That's what Bob Kramer says. Pee Wee Reese says it was the most beautiful place he ever saw. So you can think it. I wanted
Somewhere in between.
way back.
Get to the A's in a minute.
I wanted to get way back to there's a wonderful writer who I wish could be here, and Bob and everybody, Marty would, and Bill Hines, just a most marvelous guy. And one day, John Lardner was saying to me, John Lardner, Ring Lardner's son, a tall, severe, incredibly gifted man, and an honor to be in the same field he is. John said, Hines is a good writer. And I said, and a good reporter. And Lardner said, the one presumes the other.
Very good.
I think if you look at the whole first half of the century, there are practically no serious good baseball books. Here is Ring Lardner's marvelous stuff, which I just want to give you a little bit of a smidgen of. And there's a book that I think belongs with Jude the Obscure and the Brothers Karamazov by Christy Mathewson called Pitching in a Pinch. My father left me that as well, but there were no good books. Suddenly, magically, in 1952 and 3, we get The Natural by Bernard Malamud, not the movie, the book, and we get Bang the Drum Slowly by Mark Harris, and suddenly you can do, not just in a newspaper, not just in a, you can do a big book. But Lardner is always out there. Everybody who wrote well about sports is a descendant of Ring Lardner, and he wrote and reported very well. And I just have a little bit of this stuff from my research, which could be of interest. My father's Busher letters, John Lardner said, were not written with artistic prestige in mind. This was a book, You Know Me, Al, which I hope you will look at. They were written because there was an urgent need around the home for the $200 each brought. As soon as the Saturday Evening Post began to publish them, the letters made their author as famous as the President of the United States. This turn of events startled my father, but it totally failed to cause him to think that what he had written was literature. And on my researches, he didn't get 250, he got 1250. So John Lardner's dad was a pretty wealthy guy. And Jack Keefe is the hero when he's from a little town, he's writing to his friend, and he don't spell good. And there's this little section here where Keefe gets sold to San Francisco. He falls in love with Hazel, a great big strapping girl, must weigh 160 pounds. White Sox get him back, and Hazel writes to Jack Keefe. She wants $100 so she can come to Chicago and marry him. Keefe sends her $30. Hazel never makes the trip. And here is what Jack Keefe writes to Al. I'm the happiest man in the world. Al, she is married. Maybe you don't know why that makes me happy, but I will tell you, she's married to Kid Levy, the middleweight. I guess my $30 is gone because in her letter she calls me a cheapskate, and she enclosed one 1-cent stamp and 2 twos, and she said she was paying me back for a glass of beer I once bought her. I bought her more than that, Al, but I won't make no holler. She also, which Lardner spells A-L-L space S-O, she also said not for me never to come near her, or her husband would bust my jaw. I ain't afraid of him or no one else, Al, but there ain't no danger of me ever bothering her. She was no good. Virginia Woolf, who never saw a game of baseball, who read You Know Me, Al in the early 1920s. Jack Keefe, she wrote, was a character through whom, and I am now quoting Virginia Woolf, we gaze into the depths of society. Mr. Lardner provides something unique, something indigenous to the soil, which the traveler may carry off as a trophy to prove to the incredulous that he has actually been to America and found it not an appendage to England, but a foreign land.
Very good. This is for Ring Lardner.
The Roger's point is very well taken on the state of baseball literature through most of the first half and beyond of this century. I happen to be a book collector, so it's a special interest of mine. Sometimes I compare it to good pitchers on the Philadelphia Phillies between Grover Cleveland Alexander and Robin Roberts. There were none, there weren't very many good.
Mulcahy.
Losing pitcher Mulcahy, they called him.
Boom, boom, bang.
Right. I think the two novels you cited are well taken as terrific books, but if you're going to write fiction, you better be a writer, because you're just not dealing, with facts and turning a newspaper story into a full-length book. I think baseball writing, in terms of books, started to mature in the early 60s when you had two biographies come out, or autobiographies within a year of each other, that kind of were not Horatio Alger stories, but had an edge and took some shots at some people. And they were Rogers Hornsby's, which they wrote with Bill Surface, and Ty Cobb's, which was the movie that was made a couple of years ago. Al Stump was the collaborator on that. Those two biographies took some shots at the establishment and kind of woke some people up, even if they didn't sell an awful lot of copies back then.
What? I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that as the 60s progressed, you had a relief pitcher on the Cincinnati Reds named Jim Brosnan, who wrote some diary sort of books on a good season and a bad season in Cincinnati. And a lot of people took notice of what you could do with the game of baseball if you started to tell a little more truth than had existed before. And then it's hard to ignore what a landmark book in 1970 or 71 was Ball 4 by Jim Bowden with Leonard Schechter, which really opened the doors to baseball. It kind of, even to this day, has made Jim Bowden a pariah among his former peers and colleagues. But it really told people what you could do if you really opened the doors of the clubhouses. Now, when the book came out, it was very scandalous. The little tales he told of Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford, they totally denied and, said this has never happened. But it wasn't too many years later that Mickey and Whitey did a book with Joe D'Urso where they told the same stories as their own. So baseball writing really matured at that point, and then Roger's Boys of Summer showed that there were masses of people out there that would read good baseball literature, and that kind of opened the door to a succession of baseball books that could actually become bestsellers. So,
Marty, it's interesting you bring this subject up because it's a question I've always dealt with throughout my entire professional career, and that's the right to know. How much should the fan know? How much should the reader know? What are we really dealing with when we're telling intimate stories about ball players? I happen to have one little intimate story and experience. It may be the most significant thing that ever happened in my career, I don't know. But my wife and I invited two ball players to our home one night in summertime with a couple of other friends. One was named Fritz Peterson, a left-handed pitcher for the Yankees. The other one was named Mike Kekich, another left-handed pitcher for the Yankees. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, they left our homes, and the next morning I got a call that they had decided to exchange wives, dogs, kids, cars, houses, just about everything else. And I said to Fritz Peterson, who happened to be a close friend of mine, Kekich was not, and I said, Fritz, are you crazy? I don't care what you do, but I'm not going to be the guy to write it. So I immediately told my boss, Ike Ellis, the sports editor of the New York Post, this was quite before spring training, that I'm not going to spring training around the Yankees. I don't want to get involved in this. I'll go to that new team over there, the Mets. I know they're not very important, but I'll go over to the Mets and I'll spend spring training over at the Mets. And they assigned the first female that had ever covered spring training in New York by the name of Sheila Moran. I forget whether you were the PR guy or not at the time. And that was a rather raucous spring training event. And to this day, I have questioned myself and said, why did he ever make this thing public? Did we have a right to know this, or should this have been left in my house and his house?
he had actually heard that Kekich had made it public. He was a holdout that spring. He was on the West Coast. He heard Kekich had made it public, so he contacted Milton Richmond to get his side out there at the same time. Meanwhile, in our naivety, we decided we could still keep this quiet by bringing all the beat writers who were in spring training into Ralph Houck's managing office and say, look, something's happened here, but we don't really want this to get out, so we're just going to tell you. We did not include in that conference Sheila Moran because she wasn't one of the boys that we could trust. So she found out on her own, broke the story ahead of the other people, and was the absolute perfect reporter to cover this, the woman's side of this and everything like that.
It's
It was also Steinbrenner's first spring training. He had just bought the team.
73.
73.
Yeah. It's also interesting that probably the most dramatic change in sports writing, I don't know if Bob and Roger and Marty would agree to this, but I think the most dramatic change in sports writing is not the writers, it's not television, it has nothing to do with that. What it really has to do with is seeing females in a baseball locker room with 25 naked men. When I saw that for the first time, I didn't know what to do or how to explain it, and I must admit, many, many years later, it made me very uncomfortable, and 25 years later, it still makes me uncomfortable.
But still, it's uncomfortable, but their presence doesn't change the coverage.
No, there's a story, I mean, I think the change, the profound change is the scores in the fourth paragraph.
Yeah.
That's the change. And I don't, they're going to say, look, the score's in the head. But we know that. And Dick Young, who was probably the best when he was having a good year and was free to be himself and was not encumbered to management or to a lady management provided, Dick would say the whole way to write baseball for a newspaper is this. In yesterday's 3-2 Dodger victory, the most important and interesting thing that happened was, that was a diagrammatic lead.
But what's happened, of course, is that in those days, we got our information from the newspapers.
Right.
I mean, when the World Series was over, the last game, you went in to interview somebody, the writers got all around the person, and when they finished, then television came up. Now it's the other way around. Television has taken over. Television is the tremendous.
Young used to stand in front of the camera to block their shot. He so resented their presence.
For a while.
I just wanted, Maury's point of being shocked by seeing all these, you weren't shocked by seeing these naked men.
No, I wasn't.
I didn't get it right. I was startled one spring training when somebody was covering the Yankees, and she shall be nameless, and she was in the locker room so long that Marsh Samuel, who was doing PR in Lauderdale, said, geez, I don't know whether she's in there with a tape recorder or a tape measure. Well, I didn't write this none, but the New York Times, who none of us is foolhardy enough to criticize, was run then by a couple of guys named Abe Rosenthal and Arthur Gelb, and they were having some trouble on their hiring policies, and they needed to get a woman executive. I don't know if you know this story, because some memos had come forward and the newspaper guild got them. So the guild said, we're not going to have a sexual prejudice suit if you agreed to make a woman an executive. So they got together and said, well, we got to have a woman exec. Well, we can't do national news, that's important. We can't do foreign news, that's important. We can't, financial business, women don't know money. Sports. So somewhere out of the miasma of the past came somebody named Leanne Schreiber. She was there for 2 years, and she's happily gone. And she had come from a magazine called Woman's Sport, not a very good magazine. And it was very unfortunate for everybody. There are all kinds of great women sports editors and journalists now, but they were not then. So I'd been hearing all of this stuff, and they were drafting me to do pieces for small wages. And I said, you know, we could do a light piece, I said to Leanne. I had once in a lovely time in my life gone out a few times with a simply gorgeous lady tennis player named Gertrude Augusta Moran, called Gorgeous Gussie. And we knew each other so well, she told me that in Wimbledon, it's so elegant, there are no showers. Ladies who play in Wimbledon must take baths. For some reason, that stuck with me, the way that they could, guys stuck with you. And I never forgot it. I said to Leanne, look, here's the thing. You're sending this person to do Reggie Jackson in the shower. It's at times you have some money. I want to go to Wimbledon. I would really like to interview Chris Everett in the tub. Oh, she looked at me as though I were Roger the Raper, and she said, tacky. So I said, well, you know, I've seen pretty people in the tub. And she said, tacky. I said, I'm not going to jump in on top of her because I don't want to lose a suit. Tacky. I said, I'm not going to get there because Valkyries and cops will grab me. It's going to be a funny piece. Tacky. And I went down to Sorties, which was under the Times, and I went to the saloon to commune with John Barleycorn, and Vincent Canby was sitting next to me, and I said, this newspaper's supposed to be great, no sense of humor, mutter, 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 what's your problem, I told him. He said, that's really a shame, and then I went home, and Canby must have talked, because about 3 weeks later I got a call from Playboy. He said, we would like to send you to Wimbledon and assign you to interview Chris Everett in the tub. And you know what I said to Playboy? Tacky.
You know, we probably shouldn't let Dick Young's name pass too quickly, because I think he's a very important figure in all of this. And he went from liberal to conservative, and he went from the News to the Post, but whether you loved him or hated him, you had to read him. He was a really important guy, and he kind of changed the way sports was covered in the daily newspaper also.
Well, back when game stories were important, his game stories were as good as they could get almost.
Well, we were I mean, I broke in, and I broke in with Dick, and Dick said, hey, 3 days I'm going to help you, and I'm going to cut your vital parts off, you know, and he was, when people made incursions into the rights of reporters to go into the trainer's room, Dick and I would say, no, we're going to go into the trainer's room, and you're going to have to physically throw us out. Nobody wanted to take on Young and me and the Tribune and the News. And as things began to happen, and I thought, you know, gosh, I guess we were pretty formidable. I learned a tremendous amount from Dick, and I think the key thing I learned, I mean, Maury covers a beat now. I don't. If you're going to say that somebody is a terrible ball player, and he choked and he blew the game, which is certainly your right to say, then the next thing you got to do is go in the clubhouse and face him the next day. And Dick would do that. And once I wrote that Walt Moore, not a Hall of Fame name perhaps, but a name that's known up at this table, and he misplayed a drive and lost the ball game, and I said, Walt Moore was struck in the glove by a batted ball. Walt Moore was a great moose, and God, I thought I did this, you know, I die. Well,
One of the things about sports writing and dealing with athletes, I think all of us who've covered locker rooms can attest to this. These are not the most wonderful human beings in the world after they have blown a game or been involved in a controversial play, and they can sometimes express it in the only way they know, which is physical. We express what we do, I think, mentally and through the written word. They express it physically. Ralph Houck was the manager of the New York Yankees, very successful, won a few pennants in a row. Then he became the general manager, and Johnny Keane was the manager of the Yankees. And they fired Johnny Keane, and Ralph Houck came back as the manager. And after about 20, 30 games, I noticed it was not really the same. The players didn't respect him the same way they had. They were not intimidated by him. He was older, he was heavier, he had lost his fire, he had lost his physical presence. And so I wrote a column about this fact and about the fact that the Yankees don't seem to be intimidated. And somewhere along about the 15th paragraph of the column, I used the word marshmallow. And the next morning I arrived on the field, and there was Ralph Houck waving towards me. When a manager waved toward you, you always knew it was bad news. They never waved at you to give you a good story. That always came out at 3 o'clock in the morning at some bar. Anyway, Ralph was waving at me, and I went into his office, and he locked the door behind me, and I knew I was really in serious trouble by that time. And he grabbed me by the shirt collar. This is in Florida. I'm wearing a polo shirt. And he grabbed me by the shirt collar, and he started to rattle me against the door, and he was about 230 pounds, and in those days I may have been 165 pounds, and he started screaming about the column I wrote and how terrible it was, and I thought it was mostly pretty accurate except for the word marshmallow, and I screamed out as he was choking me, did you read it? And his answer was, what has that got to do with anything?
But you know, there were some ball players who were a little bit the opposite of that. I can think of two. One was Vic Wirtz, who was a marvelous guy who played for the Detroit Tigers and the Cleveland Indians. He's the guy who hit the ball that Willie Mays caught, that great catch. Well, the next spring, the Giants wiped out the Indians 4 straight. And the next spring in Cleveland, in Arizona, the Indians and the Giants always played spring training games against each other. And the first exhibition game in the spring had been billed as the 5th game of the World Series, the Giants against the Indians. In the series the year before, the Giants' fielding was so good, and they were so sharp, and the Indians were so bad. It was unbelievable. And there were 2 plays in the series that are very interesting. We got great photographs of them in Sports Illustrated. The Giants were in the field. The Indians had a man at first base, and someone hit a ball right back to the pitcher, Johnny Antonelli. Excuse me, it was a man at second base. Nobody in first base. Ball was hit right back to Antonelli. He instantly ran right towards shortstop, where Bobby Avila, the runner, had come off and was waiting to see what the pitcher would do. And instead of hesitating, Antonelli just ran right towards him, and finally Avila fell down. And there was Alvin Dark, and I think the second baseman was there, and Antonelli, and our photograph showed all three of them with the ball on a vela looking at first base to see that the batter who hit the ball didn't turn first base. A game or so later, the Giants were at bat, and they had a man at first and Alvin Dark at third. I'm sorry, Alvin Dark was at third base. The ball was hit back to the pitcher, and the pitcher turned and looked at third base, and Dark was in a rundown, and he kept moving back and forth, and the pitcher didn't know where to throw it, and he finally threw it here. Dark was finally tagged out, but as he was being tagged out, he was motioning to the base runner how to move. The Giants ended up with man on first moved to third, the man who hit the ball ended up in second, so the Giants gained 2 bases while losing an out, where the Indians lost a base. The next spring, they're playing the first game, and Vic Wertz is playing first base. A lot of white shirts in the stands behind third base. Again, the Giants had a man on third base, and the ball was hit back to the pitcher, Don Mossy, who had big ears. And he turned to throw the ball to third base to Al Rosen, who was a wonderful guy and a great hitter, but not a great fielder. And whoever the Giant base runner was off a few feet, and Mossy turned to throw to Rosen. Rosen went, no, first base. So Mossy turned and threw the ball to first base where Vic Wertz was standing, and Vic was sort of watching through this white crowd, and the ball hit him right in the chest. And I couldn't really believe what I saw. And after the game, I went into the locker room, and I went up to Wertz, and I didn't even know Wertz at that time. And I said, excuse me, I said, did that ball hit you in the chest? Now, ordinarily, a guy would hit me in the mouth for saying that. And Wertz said, yeah, look, it was the right spot.
You know, some of you may marvel at his recollection of the nuances of that play. And baseball people have a tendency to remember these finite little details. Players, too. You could go up to Jim Turner, who's still living, who's like 91, I think, and say, 1938, Boston against Cincinnati. And he'll tell you, well, I started him off with a curveball. They remember these things. It's incredible.
There's a wonderful story.
Mark would do at the end of the game 120 pitches.
Yeah.
And you'd say, well, what was the ball Hodges hit to right center? He said, well, there's not a very good slider on the outside. I started him with this, and you could do with Spawn 120 pitches. And I was in Cooperstown a year or two ago on the veranda of that wonderful hotel, the Otasaga, and there was Spawn and myself and my wife and Spawn's wife, not the same wives we had in 1955, and there was a little bit of warmth. You're not writer and player after 40 years, you're just guys, and you're alive. And so hello, introductions, and I said to my wife, this is a shrink, trying to fill a gap, I said, this man, when he finished the game, could give you 125 pitches out of his head in sequence. What an extraordinary thing. And he looked at Katie and he said in a very deferential way, but Mrs. Kahn, pitching is what I did.
There's a story that, talking about, to illustrate how these players remember everything. In 1978, the Yankees beat the Boston Red Sox in the famous playoff in Fenway Park. And the last out of the game was a rather dramatic out. The tying run was on third base. Goose Gossage was the pitcher for the Yankees, relief pitcher. The batter was a future Hall of Famer, Carl Yastrzemski. It's 2 out. Carl Yastrzemski is up, and this is a story that Goose Gossage told me, not that day, but about 15 years later. But it was very useful even 15 years later. He said, I'm getting ready to pitch, and I'm stretching, and as I go into my motion to pitch, I hear Greg Nettles, the third baseman. He's yelling at the top of his voice, pop him up, pop him up, pop him up, as loud as he could possibly yell in the Yankee infield. And sure enough, Gossage throws one of those 100-mile-an-hour fastballs, and Carl Yastrzemski, this great hitter, does pop up. The ball rises straight up in the air, and the first thing Gossage heard as the ball went up in the air and it curved towards third base was Nettles yelling, "But not to me!"
You know, on this,
You looked at the audience.
On the
And is there any other sport that you want to discuss?
Oh, it's
And I'm
wonderful.
loving it.
the one spring training,
Are there other sports?
which would have been about about 1975 or 76, the Yankees were staying in the tackiest little motel on Federal Highway in Fort Lauderdale called the Fort Lauderdale Inn. It was really a motel. And I had my room there, and the walls were paper thin, and Steinbrenner used to work us like from 8 in the morning till 11 at night, and I got back to the room, and all I could do was like pass out in bed. And lo and behold, around 12:30, in the room next to me, Catfish Hunter and Lou Piniella were roommates, and they arrived back at the motel. And they had had a Chablis or two, I think, during the course of the evening. And they came in very loud, woke me up, and very profane, and I thought, oh no, this is going to be terrible. They're going to be yelling at each other all night or whatever went on. Well, they did. They went from about 12:30 till about 4 o'clock, and you know what they were yelling about? They were going over every hitter in the American League, how you pitch them, and they were disagreeing, but they were going over every hitter in the American League. So these guys really do live the game.
I want just one thing before we go to questions, which is that I think if you're going to be good at baseball writing or whatever, you cannot say these idiots have never read Charles Dickens and they're making $3 million a year. It's not about reading Charles Dickens. It's about free and open market. And if you don't respect what they do, I mean, some of my closest friends in my life have come out of baseball. And I've written harsh stuff once in a while. Certainly I have harsh things about Mantle mixed in with affection. But if you have a respect for them, I had callers can say to me, did you think I knew you wanted to be a major league ball player? Well, you didn't have to be very subtle to know that. And he said, do you know how much I wanted to be a writer and a poet and I know music, and this goes on. And getting beyond the typing of books and the hitting of computers and what all of us do to pay our mortgages and whatever is a transcendent moment in my life with a little tiny sequel. And I had lost a child to heroin. And I was single then. I was living on my hill in Croton. There's nobody around. 3 days after my son was in the ground. And when you lose a child, I pray nobody has that experience. You wonder how much you want to go on. And there I was alone, and I was drinking not Chablis. I was drinking the hard stuff. And the phone rang. It was about midnight. Harold Reese. I knew the voice. He said, "Rog, it's Pee-wee. You remember I was the captain of the team?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Well, I want to tell you, for all the fellows, we are very, very sorry." Well, the rest of the night was a little bit misty. Now, Mark Reese, who Maury knows and still works for, decides he's going to do a documentary about the Dodgers and bring all that together. And so we're standing outside the skeleton of Ebbets Field, and Mark says, "Now, I want you to tell the story about when you lost your son and my father, talk to you, and there's Pee-wee and me." And I said, "Well, Mark, if you want me to do it, I'll do it, but I'm going to miss." He said, "It's not the way it was when you guys were young. Men are allowed to cry." So I said, "All right, I'm going to give it a shot." So with a deep breath on Bedford Avenue, I tell this tale, and here is Pee-wee right there. So I, captain of the team, "Well, the fellows, we are very, very sorry. Beat. It's all from the heart." And I put out my hand and I said, "So, for all the rest of my life, I will thank you in my heart and prayers." And Pee-wee started to cry. And here's what happened. The kid cut it from the documentary. But I mean, love is not the only
I think
love is the
one of-
last way, but it's about loving a game, loving the language, and loving the people in it. That's
In a rather subtle way, I think what we're all saying here tonight is that professional athletes are no different than any of us. I mean, there are some nice guys, there's some not nice guys, there's some bright guys, not so bright guys. The only difference is their particular unique skill in what they do. And I think, as everybody said, they arrive at that position of excellence and earn the salary they earn because they have dedicated their lives, in most cases, singly to this particular desire to be a professional athlete. And They are a mixture of people, and you have fun being around them, and I think the most exciting thing about being a sports writer is actually writing about human beings, people, telling their story one way or another, and actually having somebody else say, hey, I read what you wrote about so-and-so, and that's the real kick. And when I was writing for the New York Post, and I was riding the subway the early years when I started writing there, and I would actually see somebody reading something in the New York Post that I wrote, I kept peeking at him to see what he was reading and how fast he was reading it, and I wanted to say, I wrote it. Never could, but it was fun watching him.
Laurie, it was Ralph Howe. I did a story once in Sports Illustrated back when we used to jump the stories. We had continued on page 87. I was in a train going to Boston. We used to take trains to Boston then. And I was in a club car having a Chablis. And I noticed this man across the aisle reading the story I wrote. And I was watching him to see whether he would stay with it and get down to the jump line, continue to page 78. Would he turn? And he turned to page 78 and read one sentence and put it down. I want to say something before.
That was not your sentence, that was put in by an editor above you.
I'm afraid it was one. I want to say one thing before I forget to do it, because I just noticed something. In this audience tonight is a man who's sort of a guru of, at least as far as I'm concerned, of sports writers and people in sports writing, really a great sports editor. Who edited Sport magazine for many years, Ed Fitzgerald. We all think the world of Ed.
Bob.
Well, why don't you stand, Ed?
About Craig?
Hey, we can't see him. This man, this transcendent thing that he did, aside from teaching bunches of us how to write longer than 800 words, how was Jackie Robinson covered? Not well. Sports Illustrated offered me a lot of money to come to work there. I wanted to write about Robinson. No, it was not over prejudice, but they were too wide. Ed Fitzgerald was the one person who said, he came to me because I'd been with the doctors, and he said, would you write a piece called The 10 Years of Jackie Robinson? And it's so much guts.
John Lardner, who is, if not the best of all people who wrote about sports, awfully close to it, for various personal reasons, I guess having to do with his father, Henry Luce, would not write for Sports Illustrated, but he wrote for Ed at Sport magazine. And Ed Lynn, another marvelous writer, wrote for Ed, lots of them. Anyway, it's good to have you here, Fitz.
You know, it was interesting. Roger, you may be better able to answer this question than anybody. I always thought that the finest sports writer, the greatest writer, with a capital W, I ever read was Red Smith. And I remembered asking Red many years ago, when I was just a kid reporter, and he was already Red Smith, of course, why are you writing sports? The assumption being he could write the greatest novel, anything.
Good question.
And his answer was, where else could I have this much fun? And it really was a line that stayed with me, and I think that we are advertisements for it, that when you write sports, even when you've been doing it for quite a few years, and I guess when we add it up here, we're into 150 or 200, it's still fun, and that's what really counts.
Well, the other thing Red said, I think we have to build into this, is that Red was an absolute master of his craft, and one day I said, have you ever thought of writing a novel? And Red said, I have thought about it, and the idea fills me with horrible dread. There's somebody else we should mention that also Ed Fitzgerald encouraged and published one of the truly great artists who wrote sports, W.C. Hines, yes. Bill Hines, a man without peer, still alive in Dorset. Bill had he had the misfortune or fortune to ghost a book with a surgeon who was over in Vietnam. And the book is bylined by Joseph Hooker. The surgeon hooked in golf, and Bill thought that by ghosting he was doing something which relates to hooking. And this became MASH. Yeah. The last time I was up to see Bill, he was getting some kind of residuals beyond belief, even beyond your wildest dreams of avarice, Bob, and I know those are extreme. And I said, we're walking down a little road in Dorset, Vermont. This guy wrote the greatest Pete Reeser story, the greatest Rocky Graziano story. He was and is, he's just a great artist. And so we're walking and kicking dirt, and I said, "Are you going to do another book?" He said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do next?" He said, "I'm going to take a great maple tree, and I'm going to write about the tree, and about the woodsman who fells the tree, and about what happens to the wood that comes from the tree, and what happens to the woodsman." Go on another 150 feet. I said, Bill, that is not the most commercial idea for a book I ever heard of. Bill said, "It don't have to be."
I remember Bill Hines when he wrote for the New York Sun when I was a kid, probably 18 or 1940, 41. He wrote a little thin column sort of in the back. That was quite a sports section. Frank Graham wrote for it. A lot of people. And Bill Hines, it's just by W.C. Hines, these little single column things. And God, they were good.
There's a little story about the press and critics and such. Bill wrote a novel called A Professional about a boxer, based on the boxer Billy Graham. You would remember Billy Graham. He was a great professional. He wasn't maybe a great fighter. And the novel goes to the fight. He trains and trains and trains. He gets knocked out by a lucky punch, and Bill...
He only beat 5 champs.
Hey! Is that Bill Hines up there? The novel came out, not much happened, and Bill was in Toots Shores where they serve Chablis. And Shore said, how's the book going? And Hines says, not going great. He says, well, what does Papa say? So Hines said, I don't dare send it to him. Give me a copy. So Shore sent it to Hemingway in Cuba. And about a week later, a telegram came to Bill Hines. And it said, W.C. Hines, The Professional is the best boxing novel I have ever read, and a fine first novel by any standard. And Ernest Hemingway. Bill began to weep, a perfectly good thing to weep about, and the book did okay. And 2 weeks later, Time magazine came out with a review, and in those days, Time's reviews were not signed. And they said, this novel is so awkward and so ill-constructed that the writer must have written it while he was wearing boxing gloves. And Hines wept for a second time, and after a while he recovered, and he said to me, what am I getting upset about? I got a telegram from Ernest Hemingway. What is a Time book review anyway but an anonymous postcard?
You remind me of something that Jerry Holland said years ago. Jerry Holland was a writer for Sports Illustrated, and he used to go to Shores now and then, periods when he wasn't drinking. He would be very good and observe things. And Jerry said, that's the damnedest place. He said, all I do over there is cry. You won't cry. Awful lot of crying in sports.
There's a quick Pee Wee Reese story, which is, we were working on this thing, and he said,
Cheers.
I was in the clubhouse, and Thompson hit the home run. It's a great day in the Creamer household. And Thompson hit the home run, and there was Branca making an ass of himself, crying and crying and crying. He said, not me. I didn't cry till I got home.
My favorite anecdote that goes with the famous Bobby Thompson game is, see, the Yankees were already in the World Series. They obviously won the American League pennant, so the players went to the Polo Grounds to watch the Dodger-Giant deciding game, partly because this is what they did. This was their profession, and partly, of course, to scout the teams because they'd be playing them the next day. Was the series start? Yeah, the next day.
Yes, it did.
Anyway, one of the players was Yogi Berra, who was now a 5-year veteran with the Yankees, and of course their catcher and most valuable player. And he went, and this was the game, of course, if you don't know it, and I can't imagine you'd be here tonight and not know it. Dodgers are winning. Bottom of the ninth, Bobby Thompson's home run completely turns the game and the pennant around, and the Giants win. Yogi Berra, Mr. It Ain't Over Till It's Over, left in the 7th inning.
Went home with risotto? When Roger mentioned Hemingway, there's one quick Hemingway story. Hemingway used to hang out at Shores, and Shore was a great storyteller, and he told me the story of the 1941 Joe Louis, Billy Conn championship fight. And Joe DiMaggio was a great fight fan. And Shore, Hemingway, and Joe DiMaggio walked down the aisle. I think the fight was at Yankee Stadium, I'm not sure. But anyway, they walked down the aisle at Yankee Stadium, and the fans are all screaming, yelling, Joe, 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 give me your autograph, Joe. This is the day before you had to have a contract to sign autographs, so I guess he signed a couple of them. And they're walking down the aisle, and all of a sudden, a little bit behind DiMaggio is Ernest Hemingway, wearing his beard in those days, a rather significant writer, and a kid pokes Shaw, and he points to Hemingway, and he says, "Is he anybody?" And Hemingway hears him, and he points to DiMaggio, and he says, "Yeah, I'm his doctor." So fame is rather relative.
One of the shortest.
Mr. Freeman happened to tell me on Babe Ruth. I saw him play.
So did I. What'd you think of him? What did he do when you saw him?
Some background stories that they never published.
Well, we published a lot of them.
About the time when he ate the hot dogs and he got a bellyache. Was it really the hot dogs that gave him the bellyache?
That's not what you think it was either. The story, the big rumor was that it was
A social disease.
a social disease, to say politely. But but he got back to New York after all this. All that spring, he'd been raising hell. He'd been, as Joe Dugan told me, the old ball player, he said all it was, if you forgive me, was booze and broads, booze and broads. And he didn't sleep much. He was breaking up with his first wife. It was a difficult time, and he got sick. He got some kind of a flu bug, and he wasn't eating, and he got to Asheville, North Carolina, and he collapsed and hit his head, and they put him in a hotel, and they finally put him in a train to take him back to New York. And he was feeling a lot better, because he came near New York. He went to the club car and had a breakfast of bacon and eggs and French fries and everything else, and got violently ill. When he got to New York, they took him to St. Vincent's Hospital, and they eventually operated on him for an ulcer. He had a scar on his abdomen. Now, I don't care if you have syphilis or gonorrhea or what, you don't get a scar like that in your operation from it. I don't question that Ruth may have contracted a social disease in his life, but it was not syphilis, and it was not the reason he had the bellyache. It was hot dogs might have been part of it, but that wasn't the main thing.
But
He was a sick
Dugan
man.
said to me in the bar of the Kenmore Hotel over at Bourbon,
Yeah.
it wasn't even a bellyache, it was something a little bit lower.
Yeah, but they all had those stories. But
I heard it was an impacted girl.
Wait, I made the remark the other day that I said one of the troubles with sports writing today is that it's just too much gossip writing. But we've had gossip writing all our lives in this thing, and baseball writers and sports writers are great gossips. We love, back when you couldn't print a lot of things, people were always telling people stories about, you know what this guy, you know what this is.
Let me
There it
just,
is.
let me just make one remark. You know, Robert Frost was the wrong guy to lie to, because when I was with him, he saw through me. He knew what I was going to say 12 minutes down the pike. And one day Frost said to me, "Do you like gossip?" I would normally say, "I abhor it, and I think Liz Smith is terrible," but I was with Frost. And I said, "Yes, I do, Mr. Frost." And he said, "So do I. Most people have a hard time admitting it." That's all.
I'm not questioning, I love to read gossip, I'm saying, but that's what.
Well, you'll
sports
buy
writers
Liz
become.
Smith's book then.
But
She's doing a book for $1 million.
My publisher, I'm getting $450 advance, and she's getting $1 million. What am I doing wrong, Lori?
You know,
Wrong gossip.
If you think that
You've got to stop.
I can
being
rewrite this
active.
thing. I'm not stuck with this.
if you think the gossip is new to today, the story was well known at the time, but long forgotten in history, and I just happened to come across it not that long ago. I think we talked about it at lunch, but it involved a column by Jimmy Powers in the Daily News, and Jimmy Powers was kind of the predecessor to Dick Young, and he would write these news and notes, the 3-dot items that are kind of prevalent today. Well, anyway, we're in 1940 with this story, and the Yankees are not winning the pennant, which, if you look it up, as Casey Stengel would say, was the only year in 8 straight years that they didn't win a pennant. So that was big news, even though they wound up losing by only 2 games. They came that close to 8 straight pennants. Anyway, this was the Lou Gehrig of 21 North Chatsworth Avenue, incidentally, had become ill in '39 and his career had ended. Now in 1940, they're playing poorly. Babe Dahlgren is the first baseman. They're not in first place. And Jimmy Powers writes, "The way the Yankees are playing, it looks like they all got polio." Outrageous thing to say. So anyway, Tommy Henrik and Bill Dickey are leaving Yankee Stadium one day in 1940, and this little kid runs up and he says, "Oh, Mr. Henrik, Mr. Dickey, can I have your autograph?" And the father of the little boy says, "Ah, get away, they've got polio." Anyway, Henrik and Dickie go back inside. They find Joe McCarthy, the manager. They say what just happened outside. The Yankees, or Dickie and Henrik, I don't remember if it was the team or the players, sue Jimmy Powers and win and collect, I think, $17,000 from the Daily News and gave it to Gehrig. And that's all a true story.
Marty, I'd like you to add a little bit to the story that you told me, though it never got printed. We ought to give it to this audience, the Babe Dahlgren part of that story. Do you recall it?
How he eventually left baseball?
What the impact of somebody writing something is on a ball player and the weight that it means.
Well, Dahlgren just died within the last 12 months.
Now, so it's safe to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this story, he fought to clear his good name all these years, when in truth, I hate to tell him, nobody really cared after all these years. But he was not playing that well. The Yankees were not winning in 1940, and it began to be whispered, and probably started by McCarthy, that Dahlgren smokes marijuana. Which
1940.
was unheard of in 1940 for a baseball player. I think only jazz musicians even knew the word then. And Dahlgren came to, although you look it up, he played several more years with other teams after that, but he always felt he was blackballed out of baseball because of this rumor about him. And he always tried to clear his name until he died last year, and his son carried on that battle.
I think sometimes young sports writers, I know I still am around enough that I deal with young ones as well.
I still think of you as a young
That's
sports
right,
writer.
as well as our peers. That one of the things, when I was teaching journalism, I would tell the young journalists who want to go into the profession, understand the impact of the written word. Never write a word, a line, a sentence that you don't mean, you won't stand behind, and you don't know, as far as you can prove, is the truth. Because the impact of the written word can absolutely be devastating on people, and I think there are too many people today, on television especially, and in the press, who will write things that are really damaging to human beings. And I think that we need to step back and get a little more respect for each other, a little more sense of dignity, and a little more sense of reality as we're writing stories. It's not only coming up with the great line and the funny expression and the great kidding anecdote about somebody. It's understanding that this is a human being, and these people, the athletes that we write about, also have families and also suffer. And I think we have to be very, very careful about it, and sometimes we are not.
I think we might take a look, maybe with Bob, who has been around Sports Illustrated for a long time, at the Rose phenomenon, which is probably the most complicated of recent stories, or one of them anyway. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what I know. There are things I don't know. I agreed to do a book with Rose. It wasn't very much fun. Maury had tried to do a book with him, and it wasn't any fun for Maury. And I was in spring training in the year 1989, I guess, and he'd suddenly grabbed me and he said, "This Sports Illustrated has these two people that call in all the time. They're calling people I don't like, and they're asking about my gambling." He said, "I want to ask you something. Was there vultures like that in the press when you started out?" How Pete Rose has a Brooklyn accent coming from Anderson. I don't know, Anderson, Ohio. I don't know, but he does. So I thought, were there vultures like that? Can you spell Walter Winchell? No, you can't. So this went on for a bit, and then I made the best effort I could to get out of the book, and unfortunately I was with a company run by that great humanitarian Robert Maxwell, the guy who stepped off a boat. And they would let me out, maybe, but not, in 2020. So I was going to do the best I could. And I began to work with Rose's people. Rose kept ducking me. And finally, I said, there's going to be a terrible lawsuit here. And you just have to make him available And Reuben Katz, Rose's lawyer, said, well, that's all, we don't need another suit. I said, well, I got to take some time with him. And Rick Wolf, an editor, and I spent a lot of time with him. And, well, did you bet baseball? No, I got too much respect for the game. So that's not proof, but that's what he said. He said different things to other people. And then I got from the lawyers this account, which was simply that somebody Rose had bet heavily with. Bookie was in jail for not only being a bookie, but for doing drug peddling. And he couldn't pay his lawyer. His lawyer went to the people at Sports Illustrated, not Bob, but at some high, expensive level. And they said, we will sell you a story for $25,000 in which we will show you that Pete Rose bet baseball. And there was some back and forth. This is Rose's lawyers, 3 of them telling me this. And Sports Illustrated said, no thanks, we don't want to deal with a criminal. And then they went off and assigned 2 people to see what was going on. As these people, Craig Neff and a woman writer, began to call around Nick Isaski, people who didn't like Rose, which are more than one, ex-wife. Word spread through spring training like wildfire. And if it spread through spring training, it spread back to the office of a very public relations conscious and very brilliant fellow, the commissioner, Bart Giamatti. Bart Giamatti did not want to have baseball scooped on Pete Rose's bad habits on baseball gambling or on general bad behavior. So he and Vincent hired this fellow, John Dowd. And before Sports Illustrated had come out, and this was all in about 3 days, there was an announcement. Uberoff had cleared Rose in January or February. That was an announcement like March 28th. Baseball is investigating Pete Rose. What they did was run kind of a McCarthyite, not good Eugene McCarthy, bad Joe McCarthy investigation. They wouldn't let Rose's lawyers around the people testifying against them. And because of my position working and trying to get this book done and get out of this situation, I read the Dowd report. And there's some sort of awful things in it. There's a testimony of 3 felons for whom Dowd and Giamatti plea bargained. And it ends up by saying these people they're criminals, but they did what they did for the good of society. No, they didn't. I know, Bob knows, Maury knows. If you lie on a small thing, you may lie on a big one. Rose's people sent it to Samuel Dash, the famous Watergate counsel, and he gave them a quote they could use. If John Dowd turned in a report like this to me, I would fire him. But in the Watergate phenomenon, it turned out that the people who nailed the king, in this case the president, got the $1 million book contracts, and the press was not terribly interested in debating the process by which Rose got in all of this trouble. So Rose, they released the Dowd report. There's a little précis, so if you've got a tight deadline, you can do it. It's hard to read. It's somewhat persuasive. But the evidence that the lawyers had gotten on Rose's behalf, and you can say this is like an O.J. Simpson case, it's a civil case, was they said, we have gambling sheets like this, which Rose signed. This is Rose. He said, Cleveland, Chicago, so forth. And it's Rose's handwriting. I learned Rose doesn't write anything except best wishes Pete Rose, he prints. But clearly it's easier to forge printing than it is to forge handwriting. Fingerprints. Possible, they had people who said no. I'm just simply saying that there was reasonable doubt. That Rose has behaved very badly, I know. That Rose bet heavily on other sports, I know. That Rose hung around with felons, I know, and we do hold athletes to a higher standard. So after I wrote this, it was this great wash of, Kahn is as corrupt as Rose, and this sort of easy stuff. Ira Burke, I wrote in the Times, he's such a bad reporter. Why didn't he write about the tapes where Rose was recorded betting on baseball? Well, that's Ira Burkow, and he confused Pete Rose with Richard Nixon. And I wrote a little letter and said, I think Ira Burkow lost his wits, but that may have happened earlier in his family history. I was trying to say, I'm not saying he's a great guy, I don't want him to come for dinner, but I'm saying, let's give him a fair shake. Now, years later, Marvin Miller eloquently has said the same thing in his book, A Whole Different Ballgame. And Bill James, who really studies these things, says he thinks that what happened with Rose was not that he bet baseball, but he didn't pay his bookies, and the mafia framed him. So we have clear suggestion of reasonable doubt. And if you saw the quote from Sam Dash in any of the establishment press, that Dowd's report was totally inept. You better than I, because I didn't. And that's got nothing to do with the players. I don't think it has nothing. It has to do with, there's a big book advance if you're the person to whom Pedro says, yeah, I bet baseball.
There was a question.
I had a question. When you're talking about, better be careful what you write because it affects people's lives. I was very, very disturbed a couple of days ago when the New York Times had an article on the sports pages suggesting that it was in regard to the Dallas Cowboys wide receiver, suggesting that perhaps where there's so much smoke there must be fire. I was just wondering, it's Dave Anderson problem.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if anybody wants to comment about
I think that story should be in every journalism school in America for the next 50 years. I think it was a terrible, terrible embarrassment for journalism. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how lawyers think and operate, but I do know that just because somebody is famous and somebody else says something about them does not make it true, and the press should not jump on it. And I've always sort of prided myself in avoiding that kind of thing. I'm going to wait and see. I want to see a trial. I want to see the man convicted. And I think that these athletes pay a horrible price. People sit here and say, well, they're making $5 million, $8 million, $50 million, whatever they're making. They also are human beings. They are entitled to every kind of respect that we can give them as we give anybody else. And I think the Michael Irvin story is just a terrible indictment of journalism. It turns out to be, if you read the story, apparently a TV person put this on the air from the woman who made this story up. But the rest of the national press was very quick to make this into a much bigger story. And to Michael Irvin's credit, and I'm not a defender of using cocaine or anything else, but to Michael Irvin's credit, he did say something about journalism, which is, I hope you cover this situation, in other words, after he was absolved, with the same intensity you covered the arrest, the charge. And I think that's something that editors are responsible for, and Bob certainly as an editor was very responsible, and that's why I think Sports Illustrated, in the days that I was there, and I'm sure today too, was a wonderful place to work from the standpoint of incredible accuracy. You had to back up everything you said or wrote, and you had to be sure that it was true, and the lawyers got a good look at anything that was dangerous. And I blame a lot of newspapers and a lot of television stations for what they did with Michael Irvin.
This goes back,
Excuse me? Correct.
oh no, this story died very quickly and he was innocent. This goes back to what I was saying very early in this session about Homer Bigart as a war correspondent in Israel 50 years ago. He did not accept whatever he was handed. He went back and found out things and looked. There's a problem here, though, is that everything is so rapid. I mean, television is I keep calling television the villain. It wants things now. It heats everything up. It wants it fast. It wants a bite. It wants a quote. And in its news. Get it fast.
Richard Jewell, the Olympic star.
Yeah, that's another case in point. Terrible thing. But let's do it fast, right? And there's no time for reflection, no thinking back. It's the Times, not the New York Times necessarily, but the Times that we live in. I want to say one thing, not to argue with you, your point about Pete Rose being pilloried, but you mentioned Bill James, who's a friend of mine. I think he's a very fine guy and a writer, but he sometimes makes mistakes. He said last spring in his baseball preview Joe Torre as manager of the Yankees, is that Joe Torre couldn't manage a roadside vegetable stand.
That is true, but he could manage the Yankees. That's what he did, that's what he meant.
See, there's a perfect example, Bob, of a guy coming up with a funny line
Exactly.
without any sense of the fact that Joe Torre, who happens to be a friend of mine, a friend of all of ours, has put in 35 years in this profession, and he is as good at what he does as the writer who writes that line thinks he's as good. He's good.
That goes back to one of my pet peeves about a lot of writers. It seems to be more now than it used to be. They're what I call the should writers. This is what the Giants should do. This is what Steinbrenner should do. And we all sit back and say, this is what you should do. This is that guy, you shouldn't do that. The thing that drives me crazy now are the report cards in newspapers.
Yeah.
Great defense, C-, pass receiving, B+. These are guys sitting in a press box.
There's a line that illustrates this. Jimmy Cannon, who was a wonderful sports writer with the Post and the Journal American years ago, had this terrific column which has been copied by many, many people. Nobody asked me but. But Jimmy Cannon had a rather large ego. And Jimmy Cannon was on a flight, a lot of us were on it, from Los Angeles to New York in 1963. It was the first New York Yankee, Los Angeles Dodger cross-country World Series, a rather significant event for New York and for sports in general. And Jimmy Cannon was sitting next to a sports writer by the name of Jack Lang, who was the chairman of the Baseball Writers Association for a while. And Cannon went on and on, about 4.5 hours in this 5-hour flight, telling about everything he had written. And he finally said to Jack Lang, "How many great sports writers do you think there are?" And Jack Lang said, "One less than you think."
But the reality is that Jimmy Cannon was a great sports writer, and he should be remembered always for nobody asked me but if Howard Cosell was a sport, it would be roller derby.
But Joe Carroll, a wonderful guy who worked at Sports Illustrated, once did a parody of a Jimmy Cannon column. I may have to illustrate this. Cannon now and then would write a column called "Nobody Asked Me But," and he would go through a whole lot of things. Another column called "Your Name is Charlie Dresden, and you've got one day to prove yourself," and the whole thing about that. So Joe Carroll wrote this parody saying,
Good piece so far, bud.
he said, "Your name is Jimmy Cannon, and you've got a column to fill."
Well,
Cannon, but the story about Cannon was that Frank Graham, great, Jimmy talking about himself, said to Frank Graham, marvelous, gentlemanly man, great sports writer. He said, "What do you think of my writing? What do you think of me really as a writer?" This is when Cannon was young. And Graham kept demurring, but finally he said, "Jimmy," he said, "you're like a young pitcher with a great fastball and no control."
I have a question to that. Early on, we touched on the Negro League early before, and there was some emphasis on the integration of the sport. Early on also, there were some wonderful sports writers. There was Wendell Smith, who I'm sure some of you are aware of, all of you are aware of, I should say. And there's a gentleman who was still alive, from my understanding, from Sport Magazine. I remember one of the early pieces I read in the early 50s was a piece on the integration of sport. And one of the gentlemen who sat on the panel was a man by the name of Sam Lacey.
right.
Now, Wendell Smith was just put into the baseball writers' wing of all day, if I'm correct, last year.
Yes.
And I think a man he's 91 or 92 years young, he still plays 18 holes of golf, still writes his column for the Baltimore African American, and that's Sam Lacey. I would like to hear some comment, if any, of any, from you gentlemen about maybe some of the early warriors, I call them baseball warriors, who wrote for the Chicago Defender, the Afro-American, the Amsterdam News, etc.
The only one I knew was Wendell Smith. I met him in Chicago. I didn't know the other men. And of course, the truth is, I didn't read them. I read the New York newspapers, which were white newspapers, mostly white writers. So I can't comment on them. I wish I could.
Sam Lacey traveled with the Dodgers and the Braves, and in those days, and we can't see clear, but the young people will have a hard time realizing that when we went back from spring training in Florida in 1950 or so, or 51 or 52, we would travel in Pullman cars that were joined, or we'd eat in a diner that was integrated, and when we got off the trains, we were in apartheid America. It was frightful. And Sam Lacey was doing something on Sam Jethro, who was a pretty good player with the Braves. And I got to know Sam a little bit. He was sort of diffident with the white press. He was overwhelmed with the white press. And I do remember in St. Louis, in 1952, there was a black newspaper in St. Louis, and the reporter for the black newspaper was allowed in the press box, but he had to sit in the second row. Like Bob, I didn't read the...
I had to sit in the second row too, though, as a Sports Illustrated.
Well, that was because you misplaced the monitor. There were two, baseball, before there was a Martin Luther King, there was a Jackie Robinson. That's a thing worth remembering. The field was integrated very, very slowly from the time Jack made his debut with Jersey City for Montreal in '46 until the time the Red Sox had Pumpsie Green was a long, long time.
57. 57.
But as slow as that was, the people in the press who were saying, and there were not many saying that, the press was much, much slower. And I remember, that blacks and women were a kind of a lower order of humanity, and not kidding entirely, but about covering stuff. In '76, Sports Illustrated asked me to do something about baseball, and they said you could have a researcher. Her name was Melissa Ludke. And we got to Chicago, and she was going to do the White Sox dugout. I do the Yankee dugout. And we got to a game fairly late. We worked as much as we could, and we went to the boards room in Comiskey Park. And I went to have a Chablis, and I had a Chablis for her, and the bartender came out and said, "Your secretary will have to drink in the hall." So I said, "She's not a secretary, she's a reporter, and I don't think she should." And this fellow, who was very diffident, and he said, "I don't make the rules." So I said, "Well, if she drinks in the hall, I will." And they were so terrified by that I ended up having to drink in the hall. Awful beige hall. I said, "Come on, Melissa, let's get out of here, we'll get a real drink." And I called Bill Beck, who's a friend of mine, probably a friend of yours. And I said, "What is this?" He said, "It's not us. It's not the White Sox, it's the baseball writers." And there were a lot of things to answer for, including the fact that
Sometimes you get a...
Ritter Collette is in the Hall of Fame and Mark Harris isn't. But anyway, that's how it... So I said to Bill, "Well, I'll tell you what, Bill. Friends though we are, if Melissa has to drink in the hall tomorrow, I'm going to work that into Sports Illustrated." Next day, she was allowed to drink with the men.
This may tie in with this, I'm not sure, but back in '67, '68, when Harry Edwards was moving the black athletes along, and they boycotted the New York Athletic Club track meet. I'm not sure it was that year, '68 or '67, but because that was in effect a white-only organization and a white-only track meet, not at the track meet, but it was a white-only organization, they disliked New York AC because they had no black athletes. Anyway, Edwards was a vibrant force, and sometime in that era, before the 1968 Olympics, there was a meeting of Harry Edwards' group out in California, and Pete Axthelm, who started the Tribune and came to us, went out to cover it, and his reporter was a young guy named Jonathan Rogers, who'd come to us from Stanford, young black guy, very bright. And Roy DiCarava, one of the really great photographers of the world, not a sports photographer, but any photographer, I think he's as good as Cartier-Bresson, went out to shoot it. And when they got out there, they discovered that there was a rule that this meeting of black athletes would not allow white reporters in. So Pete Axthelm said to John, "Well, you can get the notes," and Roy went in to shoot it. And when they came out, Pete, very decent guy, said to John, "Look, you got the notes, you did the work, you write the story." And John did, it was a good story, we ran it, and Roy's photographs were fine too. When Roy came back, he and I were more or less of an age, and we were fairly good friends. We were talking about it, and he said, John was 25 or so, and he was just interested in going in and covering this and getting the news and getting it out. But Roy, at that time, I don't know how old he was, 45 or so, and he came back to New York, and we were talking at lunch, and he was telling me what it was like, and he said, when I went in there, he said this room just filled with black kids speaking, making these remarks, this fervor, the spirit. He said, "You got to see, I grew up in Harlem," he said, He said, I was a good kid. He said, I may have stolen an apple. He said, I was a sort of a scaredy cat, and I just lived a very straight, narrow life. He said, but I still lived in Harlem, and I was black, and I had this sense of it. He said, to be in there with this sense of freedom, he said, it was so exciting for me. This is a man who was 50 years old, and the sense of moving ahead meant so much to him, and he bubbled over talking about it. Well, that fall, it opened my eyes to some things. That fall, the Olympics were in Mexico City, and I was there when Tommy Smith and John Carlos made the gesture that, in effect, got them thrown out of the Olympics after they finished first and second in the 200 meters. Marvelous. First and third, I think they were. But they walked out and they had high black socks on. And I think they may have had black berets. And when it came time to play the Star Spangled Banner, they didn't turn and face the flag. They put their heads down and raised their hands like that. And this outraged an ass named Roby, who was the U.S. Olympic Committee head from Detroit, and he raged to somebody else, possibly to Brundage, I'm not sure. And the upshot of it was that they sent Tommy Smith and John Carlos back to New York. Sitting with me at that moment when this happened, before they were thrown out of the Olympics and everything, was Roy Terrell, who later became editor of Sports Illustrated. And Roy was from South Texas, and he had a slight southern accent, and he was a very strict man, a very conservative man. He didn't like displays of things. But we sat there watching this thing, and we heard there was going to be something going on, and Smith and Carlos made their gesture and raised their hands, and Roy said, well, that wasn't so bad. And it wasn't so bad. It was a mild gesture, really. And yet they were thrown off the Olympic team for it. Well, a day or two later was the 400-meter finals, and there was a marvelous runner named Lee Evans in California, I believe, who was the favorite in this. And Evans decided he wasn't going to run with Smith and Carlos out. And people were talking to him and debating back and forth. And we had a white reporter named Anita Verschott who had access to the Olympic Village, and she went in to talk to Lee Evans, and somebody said, you can't be in here. And Lee Evans said, she's a friend of mine. So they left her alone. He finally got on the bus, went to the Olympic Stadium, ran in the 400 meters. The Americans finished first, second, and third with Evans and a marvelous runner from White Plains, Larry James, finished second. The guy from Philadelphia finished third. And Evans ran a world record 400 meters, a record that stood till a year or so ago, or a few years ago, and Butch Reynolds finally broke it. And they came in the same way with hats on and gestures, and nobody threw him off the Olympic team. It was this question of surviving the blacks slowly coming up, and you think it's taking so long, and it is so long, but there has been a little bit of progress, and it should be a lot more. I don't know what I'm going around in circles here, but these things come back to you, the relationship of whites and blacks and white writers and black writers. We had a fellow named Ralph Wiley came to work with Sports Illustrated either just before I retired or when I was going back in to do some work now and then, and he and I got to do a lot of talking together. And he would just come into my office and sit down and sort of go like that, because he just wanted to talk, just relax. He finally left the magazine and went to work and do some stuff in television. He's written 2 or 3 books I think are excellent. But he got across to me the sense of oppression he felt. It wasn't that he had to write decently. He had to write better than decently, or he was considered not very good. We could tolerate a mediocre white writer, but there wasn't that toleration for a mediocre black writer. The blacks had to be better to just stay even. Incidentally, there's a very good writer.
Early baseball, there were no blacks who were not stars.
That's right. They were stars or nobody. There's a very fine writer, I think, for the Gannett papers, Cecil Harris. I think he's an excellent.
Yes, he is.
I'm trying to get him, but his fee was
Bob, give us his favorite Casey Stengel story.
He knows more Casey Stengel stories than I do. My favorite. Oh, God. I choke when people ask me that.
same.
Oh, God, there's so many. Casey.
Same batch of them, I know.
I was thinking today my favorite Casey Stengel story, and I can't remember what it was now.
I know, but most of them are too foul to use, and a lot of them are very racial.
Awesome.
I wanted to just do something on Robinson, which is something about how hard it was really to be a black person, is to be a black person. I mean, it ain't easy being Jewish, but this is different. In 1949, not has been written 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, which has a special place in my heart because those bastards sent my friend Ringlaw into jail. Paul Robeson had said somewhere in Europe that if we had a war between the Soviet Union and the United States, American blacks might not fight because there was very little to fight for. This was refined by the press into would not fight, and these rednecks in the House summoned Jackie Robinson down there. And so Robinson testified really de facto against Paul Robeson. And he made a memorable speech as a centrist black. You may remember, Bob. He said, I'm not an expert on communism, fascism, any other ism. I'm only an expert at being an American Negro because I have 30 years experience at it. And late in the speech he says, nobody need listen to this siren song and bass. That's not Jack, that's his ghost. But he said what he had to say, and then he had a great night at Ebbets Field. He got back and I think stole home against the Cubs. But late in life, I was at a party. It was at my house, and Howard Fast, the author, has said, why did you testify against Paul Robeson? And Jack said, if Mr. Rickey, you always called him Mr., had asked me to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge, I would have done it. Near the very end of Robinson's life, and I didn't live far from him, and he couldn't see. He was blind and sick and brave, as he always was. I was helping him open some mail, and we were schmoozing in the morning, and I said, would you do that again? And he said, no, I wouldn't. I said, well, you had different views. He said, yes, we did. But the salient, Jack used the word, the salient fact of my life and the salient fact of Paul's life is the same. We are blacks in a bigoted white society.
But one of the reasons that Robinson, supported Nixon and went to the Republicans was not that he had that much feeling for that party or that president, but that he felt very strongly, as other prominent blacks did, that they had to get into the Republican Party.
Yes.
There had to be, at that time, Negro representation in both parties so that it wouldn't be polarized. Unfortunately, it's tended to be polarized pretty much. Sure.
Most of the writing that I have, and books and columns that I've read, and I'm not saying this a lot, most of the sports, the romance in the writing is about baseball. Why is that? And there doesn't seem to be that kind of marvelous nostalgia, youth memories, all kinds of things related to other sports.
Probably
to the same extent that it is in baseball.
I think probably because there is just a better connection and a better way of measuring the game between father and son, father and daughter in baseball than there is in any other sport. Whoever invented